everybody. Well, this is our last of our chapters on agriculture. Then we start a whole section on cities and urbanization. Then our final section is development. So we're kind of going into the end game of the semester. I know there's plenty of time left, but in the schedule, I think we're still like a week behind about, but that's okay. We'll get where we need to be. Anyone have any general questions before I just start talking about agriculture? Well, all right. Well, in order to have all the agriculture that we have all over the world to sustain huge amounts of populations, we've had to change the landscapes of much of the world. And you know, this happened in Minnesota, this happened in the US, and this is happening in much of the developing world right now. You know, a number of things, well, we've talked about slash and burn agriculture, but of course deforestation happened here as well. This is an old historical photo of the logging days of Minnesota, where you know, you'd have rivers filled with log jams because there was so much being cut. And the environmental consequences here were kind of similar in other climates where you had soil loss because the trees kind of hold the landscapes together. And this is even more the case in tropical landscapes, right? And so these landscapes around the world, as there was a big transition to the market economy and farming to maximize how much you put out so that you could be making the most profits, also to feed the most people, you also had these other similar problems happening. And it's only kind of somewhat recently that we've been focusing on sustainability and making sure that these are kind of manageable changes. And the geography is very uneven. Sustainability often requires more resources and more wealth. But in the U.S., you know, we have our own problems. A big part about changing the landscapes for food landscapes. You know, I showed you some terraces the other day, rice terraces mostly. In the U.S. here, we have a problem that is happening in lots of places, whereas we have aquifers, right, underground water. Well, wells, that's actually considered water mining. Mining is whenever you take any kind of resource and you're not putting it back yourself. And in theory, aquifers historically had been a bit replenishing, but they take thousands upon thousands of years to fill up. And so in general, most of ours got emptied out large amounts during the Dust Bowl. Well, when basically the early days of farming, people were not sustainable, and so they would kind of farm an area until it ran out of nutrients, and then they would just move. They would physically move. They did this along all of the U.S. all the way until basically they ran into this area, and then these populations were doing the same thing, and they all came together here, and they were taking out all of the water resources, because these are also states that are relatively dry. They're not dry like desert, but there are parts that are semi-arid. Well, you can see from the map areas that the aquifers have been replenished a bit are the areas that tend to have a little bit more rain. But we've been taking it out more quickly than it's being replenished, in a nutshell. And part of that is because we've made large reservoirs, right? You see these rivers that are kind of running through there. Normally this is water that would just kind of seep into the ground, but again, it's a process that takes a long time. But if we're putting up dams, creating large aquifers that are not in these same areas, it's useful to have an aquifer because you're storing a bunch of, reservoir because you're storing a bunch of water for irrigation, whatever you need, but that doesn't lead to replenishing the resources. Other ways that, well, again, we've changed the environment here by draining our wetlands. That's happened in much of the world. Wetlands have historically been a very biodiverse area, but you know, in the U.S., when basically evaluating land, you look at, well, how much is it worth? Well, if it's a wetland, it was considered to be worthless. So lots of them were drained out. It's one of the first things that when we see development happening in the suburbs is they'll go and they'll kind of drain out all the water from the area because, well, you can't really construct buildings not on it if it's a wetland. It's only relatively recently that we've started protecting the wetlands, mostly because, well, most of them are gone. Most of them have been drained out and turned into farms or turned into cities, things like that. Desertification is something that's been happening here, some in the U.S., but it's been happening more the rest of the world, especially since water resources are being taken. There's lots of areas that are semi-arid, that are next to deserts. The kind of classic examples that they use are the Aral Sea. This is, well, you can usually tell the age of a map by how big the Aral Sea is on it. So this map here on the wall, you know, you can, it was David Kelly, one of our professors here, our senior most professor, who put this map up many years ago. But you can see this is like a nice round lake, and it's, you know, similar in size to a Great Lake, so maybe you can kind of picture how big it is. Well, in the Soviet era, they started using all the water that was going to it for irrigation and for other things, and this is an area that is pretty dry. And so as it started to dry up, the first thing that happened was the amount of salinity, the salts in the remaining water were increasing, right? And this used to have fishing villages and whatnot, and it used to be very, well, it was sustainable for the local populations and, you know, good protein source of fish. Well, they mostly could not take how salty the water began to be. Soil salinization, right? The saltiness of soil. Very often you could see that on the landscapes in just like a white color because it's, well, we know what table salt looks like. If you can imagine, there's just a bunch of table salt spread across the landscape. There had been, for a few years, efforts to try to rehabilitate this, and rivers that had been feeding into it that had been blocked off. Well, since the area kind of fragmented politically, there has not been that much coordination, so this actually came back a little bit for a few years, and in classes like this, it would be spoken of as a minor success story, but that's just kind of reversed course, and now it's at a lower level than ever, and it's probably just going to be gone. Environmental consequences. Outside of soil salinization, the change in the land cover, you know, when we deforest, and then often that land is left as grazing land, and it's not allowed to kind of come back to a forest. Well, it's pretty easy to overgraze, especially if it's in not the best climate. And if you overgraze, then you can get landslides, you get even more soil loss just from rain washing it off. You also, through these processes, get desertification. As an image I showed you before, there wasn't, it's not like there were, they turned that area that had been a lake into cropland or anything. There's been a number of different efforts to try to get places to, well, focus on their environment a bit more. It kind of depends on the place and the country, and these have been mixed amount of somewhat successful, especially when it comes to basically educating people about techniques to improve their soil, because that's in their own interests, because that will increase their farming productivity, and switching to sustainable methods, again, for the long term. That's in general a benefit to the local population as well. You know, it has this case study here about Costa Rica, but I think we'll come back to that later. So societal consequences, this chapter also talks about slash and burn agriculture quite a bit, which I feel like we've covered a fair amount. They go into the kind of added analysis of the fact that very often, as I said, the forests aren't allowed to grow back, but it's turned into grazing land. But that grazing land can relatively easily also catch fire. And so that you have, well, all that carbon that's been taken up by the organic material released into the atmosphere. It also makes it so that it's, well, it can't really be used as grazing land if it's all been burnt off somewhat regularly. So what do we do to increase the amount of food that's available in the world? A few different things. There's been quite a bit of use of biotechnology, right, which is genetic manipulation, making crops that are more hardy, can grow better in a more diverse range of climates, because of course most plants come from a pretty specific climate niche. And this has been pretty successful, relatively. People are worried about it a bit in different countries. In Europe, they often refer to these as frankenfoods because they feel like genetic manipulation of our food has kind of unknown consequences. That's part of the reason a lot of places have switched to a focus on organic food, trying to go back to like older strains. And there's also the feeling in general that organic food, usually it's grown with more sustainability in mind, and you'll pay more for it, of course. But it does actually tend to be more nutrient dense, partially because it takes longer to grow and it doesn't grow as large. And so it's more nutrient dense. That's why, if you go to the store and you get strawberries that are organic or not organic, your organic strawberries will be like teeny tiny, right? But they'll be more flavorful because they still have the same amount of units of sugar in it. These are the kind of trade-offs that kind of depend on culturally what kind of consumption different places are doing. And of course, well, when you genetically modify crops and whatnot, you get a situation where, the pollen can blow around from different farms, and you could have a farm that maybe it's an organic farm, but they'll get pollen that will blow in from other farms that have genetically modified their crops, and then you'll get hybrids and whatnot. And there's actually been cases of farmers attempting to sue their neighbor farmers for getting the benefits of how much they spend on their genetically modified crops without paying the price. And some of those lawsuits they have won, which is kind of crazy because it's not like the neighbor did it on purpose. It was just pollen blown in the wind. Other things, they bring up precision agriculture. In the book, there's a picture of drones, and drones are being increasingly used for farming. I've also seen a real increase of using lasers to go after weeds because, well, a laser isn't going to have chemical inputs. It's not going to change the nature of your soil. And I've actually seen very recently more of the use of AI, because people can just take their phone and they could take a picture of their crop, they could take a picture of a leaf, and they could ask it to do an analysis of what nutrients are needed, what is this pest on it, what can I do about these different things. People are already putting that into work. I was a bit surprised to find that out myself. I would say also in general, the fair trade movement has been moving toward also organic and also leaning toward sustainable farming methods. But that's part of the thing about fair trade is they do that research for you, right? Most consumers don't look into where did the products come from, was it sustainable, this type of thing. So because they do look into those things, they cost more. So poor countries can't really take those options as much. Book talks about the Great Green Wall of Africa, a very large effort to attempt to the growth of the deserts and desertification has been a big problem on the countries bordering the Sahara Desert, right? In the book, it'll mention the term kind of the Sahel. What that term means is Africa south of the Sahara Desert, right? Because historically, this big desert has been, it's been a natural impediment to travel, whatnot, right? So cultures above and below and economies and whatnot. Although they're on one continent, they have historically been very separated from each other. So when people talk about Africa south of the Sahel, they're talking about sub-Saharan Africa is another term that non-locals use. Well, as I was saying, you had a lot of deserts that are growing, and these are some of those countries that when you study population, they still have a rapidly growing population, right? So they need more food, they need to update their food practices. Well, there's been a huge international effort to try to plant trees along here in order to try to stop the desert from encroaching. And that's been like a relatively successful thing, actually. And a lot of the efforts to slow down desertification have continued in these countries that, well, finally need it. Some maps, this is a map basically of plant diversity. I think more interesting, a map showing, well, if food is grown mostly to feed people or for fuel, right? Well, as you can see, a bunch of the world, a lot of the crops that are grown to feed animals rather than primarily people. If culturally a place decides to lean more toward, well, less toward beef and more toward plants in their diet, they can sustain larger populations, right? And so it's no coincidence that you could see areas that we know of with large populations and growing populations, they've tended to lean toward those types of crops. Technically, other areas of the world, if they wanted to lean more toward food as food rather than fuel, or the term fuel, what that's talking about is also, well, I talked about this last lecture about corn having subsidies to being made into ethanol. As a lot of countries have wanted to kind of go a bit green, they've tried to put that into their energy mix. But of course, you're sacrificing an amount of food when you do that, when you're growing corn to put in your gas tank. Some information in this chapter about the waste of food, because when it comes to hunger, well, a lot of food is wasted, right? As you can see, a lot of it is wasted in the consumption level. At your grocery store, if food hasn't been sold before the end of the day, a lot of it is just thrown out, and it's not necessarily bad. And in fact, that's why you have, dumpster diving subcultures that kind of emerge, is they'll jump in and grab some amount of food that's been thrown out. To counter that, a lot of grocery stores have done things to try to destroy the food as it's thrown out, because they feel like people dumpster diving it, well, it could be a lawsuit, but they also, that's competition in a way. That's, people would have otherwise bought food if they weren't dumpster diving it. Consumption level, right? The old statistic that half the food is thrown away before it's sold. Also, you get to see in the production process, there's a lot of food that's wasted. A lot of food, if it has some kind of slight imperfection, if someone feels like the potato looks a little unusual and someone won't pick it when they're picking their potatoes. So those are often be tossed out in the process, right? So lots of actual food that is very consumable is wasted. That's actually another thing they're talking about, using AI to try to coordinate these things a bit more so that there's a lot less waste. In economics, we have just-in-time production, which means, if you're producing something, you don't want the assembled parts to come together until you're ready to assemble it, because you're paying for a bunch of storage. They're hoping to kind of do a similar thing with food. Actually, I'm not going to talk about this one. Food insecurity, right? This is something that's not just a worldwide problem. There's local problems about food security. In general, there's a couple of different things that have happened globally as places have suburbanized. Of course, when you have suburbs going in, it's usually green lots that you're taking that often used to be agricultural, that they then shift toward, well, suburbanization, suburbs. And so then that means, well, if worldwide less and less productive land, more and more of it is being turned into unproductive land. you could find your countries having less and less food, and the price of food will go up, right? A map of the percentage of populations that are undernourished. Now, of course, in the world, we grow more than enough food, right? There's plenty of countries now that have a surplus of food, to the point that a lot of diet norms have changed, and people are often eating much more food than you would necessarily need, and that coincides worldwide with a lack of food in lots of places. But of course, the classic problem about the lack of food in places is often about distribution, right? I would say when you're looking at these countries, percentage of population that is undernourished, this chapter actually talked about the Democratic Republic of Congo having a lot of problems because, well, half of the farmers of the world are women, right? But women in this region are not allowed to own property, right? So they don't have control over the farms themselves, even though they're growing the food. These types of things, right? That's why the whole end of this chapter talks about women in agriculture, and because it's the final section of this chapter, a lot of people skip it. I encourage you to not skip it. It's very interesting stuff. Basically showing how in lots of different places, because of cultural differences and the abilities of men and women, women's hands are often tied when it comes to what agricultural practices they can do and whatnot, right? And progress is happening in lots of places, but it's at different rates. You have to remember in the U.S., before 1998, if a woman wanted to get a loan for a business, she would have to have her husband co-sign. She'd have to have her husband co-sign on it, right? You could, well, that eliminates a lot of options for people. Food insecurity, another graph from this chapter looking at regional by regional basis. You can see a lot of Africa south of the Sahel still having lots of problems. Food insecurity and food deserts. Food deserts, I think, is a topic you might have come across in another class, because it's kind of very topical. Food deserts are, well, when you have areas that don't have basic access to grocery stores, something that, like living in the city here, we often take for granted. But you have to remember that there's large amounts of the population who, for example, don't have access to a car, don't drive, right? If you're very poor, there's populations like the elderly. If you don't have good public transportation, get you to places where there are food, right? There's all kinds of problems. Very often what you'll have happen is you'll have an area that will have some fast food restaurants and may have a liquor store, but like no actual good place to buy food. That's what we kind of consider a food desert. Even though there's fast food, that's not something that is, well, you can't eat fast food for every meal of every day and kind of live your healthiest life, right? Oh, I would say also, when it talks about food insecurity, the map usually is very similar to which places internationally have conflicts, right? If there's a war going on in places, there's no distribution of food often, right? And it's difficult to also just kind of switch your land into farms that rapid of a pace, especially if you have populations that are refugees and they're moving. Food production, well, through time there's been a lot of technological increases of our ability to make more and more food. This chapter kind of talks about that going into the future as being a way to increase food production, and even in places if they have bad distribution, if there's more overall food, that could help some amount of the distribution problems. Kind of depends. Women in agricultural roles, I already mentioned this a bit. Well, like I said, there's countries that women aren't allowed to own land. There's countries where women aren't allowed to get their own loan if they want to upgrade equipment. And as we know, after the Green Revolution, upgrading your equipment, upgrading your seeds, although they're controversial, they tend to increase your yields. But if you're, considered not a full citizen or something like that, you can't really do that stuff, right? There has been, like I said, there is progress through time. There's lots of, in these countries, women's groups who get together to pool resources and to educate each other, to try to kind of go past the constraints that their government legal system has on what information they can access and their freedoms of what they can do with their land. Actually, I mentioned that there was that question in here looking at Costa Rica, and I think I'm gonna have you that question, but first I'm just gonna show you some of actual Costa Rica. If I could find the group. Oh, I was looking here. Excuse me while I look through where that question was. Oh, there it is, all right. So I'm going to show you a little bit of Costa Rica. I showed you an amount of agriculture in there before that was pineapples and bananas and whatnot. This chapter talks a lot about how the mindset is changing in lots of countries. The mindset is changing, and so things like tourism, this chapter talked about specifically ecotourism, and I've done a bit of ecotourism, so I thought I would show some examples and what that means for the environment. I forget, anyone in this class been to Costa Rica? Been to Costa Rica? Well, maybe on a spring break sometime or something. So I went to a place that, it was ecotourism. The readings talk a bit about how in Costa Rica they've done a number of policies, and the government has given subsidies to people who will preserve their land. So I went to basically a monkey sanctuary where this area of land, a lot of it had been cut down, but there was some of the old forest left. And the woman who lived here, her family, when they got younger, they all moved to the city, and so she was living alone in this small building, and she allowed the government basically to kind of take over her property, to turn it into a preserve. Even though a lot of the forest had been cut down, there was enough that there was hope that it could come back. Like I said, this is a bit of a monkey sanctuary. A reminder that in the rainforest, a lot of the nutrients are just the leaves that are on the floor of the rainforest, right? Termite mound, very common to see in this area. So as you can see, there's a number of the old growth trees are back. A lot of the area had been deforested and it was switched to grazing and agriculture. As you can see, it's being allowed to kind of come back, but it takes a long time for the actual forest and trees to fully come back. This was the dry season, so the water was at a real low point, but I thought it was, because the water is so low, it was a good picture to show an example of how the tree roots in the tropics really do hold all the land together, right? And if you want to not have soil loss, not want to have giant mudslides, if you cut these down, right, then the roots all rot out, and then you have whole landscapes that are suddenly very flowing and moving. This is the area of the monkey sanctuary. I'm having some deja vu. Have I showed you guys these pictures of monkey sanctuary before? I don't think I have. All right, thanks. What happens in the country is if anyone at any point comes across an injured monkey, you could bring it to the sanctuary, and an injured monkey they'll put in a secluded area for a little bit, because if you introduce an injured monkey into another monkey population, well, it'll be very stressed and afraid because it's in a new area and it's injured, and the other monkeys can tell that it's injured, and could be lots of different things that happen that you don't want to have happen. So you have it recover in a separate area. This is the monkey who's recovering. And yes, there's a goat in there. The purpose of the goat was actually to eat the grass and keep the grass low and keep the grass from kind of taking over. But the goat does not, because the monkey feeds the goat his bananas. So the goat has no need to eat all this grass that's growing everywhere. But at least they made a friend. Another termite mound. I told you before about termites being a pretty good source of protein, maybe. You've never eaten a termite? They're very easy to harvest. You just kind of put your finger on the top of one, and you move it a little bit, and they see it as an attacker, and so they'll swarm your finger, and then you just go like, oh. And they're minty. They're minty. If you want a little mint refresher in the tropical rainforest, termites. Well, his back to you. This is Marco, who actually got his degree in geography from the University of Minnesota, and now he is a tour guide. A lot of people who study geography go into tourism, which is good, but some of the local animals that have started to kind of come back to the forest. They have kind of all your usual kind of tourist things here to try to get people to come and like I said, it's ecotourism. One big thing they've done in Costa Rica is a big public education campaign to get people to understand the importance of the forest, and actually they've turned into a really big recycle, reuse, and composting. When I've been going to Costa Rica for over 20 years, when I first started going, I would say there would just be kind of garbage everywhere. You know, it would be on the beach, it'd be even out in the forest. You'd want to do a nice tropical walk in the forest, and there'd just be garbage everywhere. And I would say, in my experience, it's been transformed. And again, that's part of it has been a government-driven public education campaign to get people to realize what this is doing, right? That all the garbage on the ground, well, it rains, and all the heat, all that is chemicals and contaminants that get into their soils that they need to grow crops and eat, and water that they want to drink. Oh, the other thing is that this specific place was going through, well, because it's government sponsored, like I said, it was this one old woman who allowed them to take over her property, but it has to be evaluated. And actually what they do is when tourists come in, very often college students, they just ask you to do some paperwork to get a free tour of the rainforest and whatnot. And so people are filling out these little worksheets to give to the government about, well, how sustainable the place is, and a number of other rules that I think I got a slide that I'll show you. The woman who used to live in that shack, well, you can't see her here because she's in a wheelchair, but part of her deal with allowing the government to take over her property was that she could still live on it, and that she is the only one who could feed the monkeys. It's against the rules for anyone to feed the monkeys, but she's allowed to, so she spends her days just putting bananas up, and then monkeys come and get them, and then she puts some more up. That's how she wanted to live out her days. This is, of course, in the region. As I said, this was a preserve, but there are certain trees that actually not only will they allow you to cut, but they encourage you to chop them down. This is, people know what this is? Yeah, bamboo. Why would it be encouraged to cut bamboo in a tropical rainforest? Yeah.
Because it
Grows really fast. It also is not from here, right? It's an invasive species. And so because it grows so fast, right, early colonials were like, hey, that's bamboo stuff from Asia, it grows super fast and it's strong. Let's just plant a bunch. Well, it edges out other species, right? And because it grows so fast and much faster than the local varieties, they can't keep up with it. And so, like I said, they encourage you to chop it down. Like I said, they were going through an evaluation process, and so people were kind of answering these forms about the different things that sustainability that were going on in their tourism process. I'm not going to take you through every single one of these evaluation things. This is actually slides that I've repurposed from a different lecture for a different class, so I'm going to skip some of that stuff. For some reason, I couldn't get these to copy over to the PowerPoint for today that we're using. There is an amount of logging that is still being done in Costa Rica. They are attempting to have it be more sustainable, meaning that Actually, they did this in Minnesota as well toward the end of our kind of deforestation days, where they make a requirement. In Minnesota, it was that 1% of the trees were not cut. That's not a lot of preservation, as you can imagine. The thought was that would be enough for it to rehabilitate. We didn't really get our forest back in Minnesota until they basically just made areas national parks. They have made areas national parks in Costa Rica, but there's still areas that are not. Lots of the areas that were forested, they have been turned into grazing land. That's why, well, when the book talks about Argentina, for example, and Argentina having a ton of beef in their daily diet, right? And there was an effort culturally to try to, well, have Argentinians just get a bit of a less of a norm of how much red meat they would eat, because it's really not that healthy. Plus they had an environmental crisis where they had a lot less, and so the price went up. And so the feeling was, well, if people could change to eating more plant-based, that would be better for them anyway. But culturally, sometimes you just can't get people to change up like that. And they only had like a slight amount of success. But a bunch of the areas that were forested are just kind of look like this now. Well, like I said, this is for a different lecture. Costa Rica. Like I said, I was there as a part of a eco-tourist package, and I would say if you're looking to do a tour and you're looking for ecotourism, be aware that places have started using ecotourism as just kind of a marketing phrase, and so you have to see how much of that there is or isn't. Look up information about the place before you go. So this is a place that I've stayed at many times over the years, and they've gone through a number of different efforts to try to kind of bring back the forest. This whole area had been basically sand, but they've done a number of different things to increase. So for example, irrigation, classic irrigation has a lot of waste, right? You have water that's going into the air, and if it's in the direct sun, it could evaporate immediately. So they've switched to a lot of drip irrigation. So you can't see it here, but there are hoses that go underneath, and they have little holes in their hose, and so little drips of water come out. And so because it's underground, it's not evaporated. It also goes right to the roots of the plants. And so you get a lot less loss. You also don't get any soil loss if you don't have irrigation of water coming down and washing away nutrients and stuff, if it's watered from underneath, basically. This is called ecotourism, but don't feel like you have to go without if you're doing ecotourism. Like I had a little refrigerator, there are lights, there was a solar panel on the roof that gives you the energy for these things, so you don't really have to rough it. Pictures of the kind of very world famous Tortuga National Park. Like I said, there was also this huge effort to get a public information campaign, and as you can see, it's in English and Spanish, because it wasn't just for locals. Actually, this one's all in Spanish. They didn't mix it up. They're mostly multi-language. So it's not just for tourists. There we go. There's one that's English and Spanish. It's for locals as well, and it was basically for people to understand what are the organisms that are here, what animals, what plants should be preserved, which plants are invasive species. This was, they've also really leaned toward garbage pickup. I would say in past years, I would just see just piles of garbage, but now they have, this is their version of a dumpster. And I know you would think that this seems unsanitary, but in the tropics, they get so much rain that if they had garbage dumpsters like we have, they would just fill up with liquid, and then it'd be impossible to kind of dump them out. So their dumpsters tend to have a mesh, and yes, it rains and this kind of leaks the stuff, but it's better than the alternative, like I said, of a great big thing just filling up with water. Another thing that the sustainable tourism has attempted to do in a lot of places, my guide said to me that the sustainable tourist industry, because they're focusing on sustainability and kind of larger social issues, a percentage of taxes from that type of tourism went to support this local school that was put in, right? This is just showing you something like in the streets. This is Montezuma in Costa Rica, and they have modern conveniences of you could do cash withdrawal. There's been a big push toward people to focus on producing local for local, right? It used to be not only for locals but for tourists. A lot of food would be shipped in, right? And it would be like Twinkies and stuff. So it'd be stuff that was not really benefiting the locals economically. They've been pushing toward having like local grown, but also organic local grown, right? And so whereas the grocery stores and whatnot used to have just a lot of stuff that was imported that was very expensive, now it's really kind of changing the mix. Some of the stuff to do at this resort. Let me go past these geology pictures. There is some of the old-fashioned sprinkler systems that are less efficient, but I took a picture just because, if you picture how much of that is just going right into the air, not into the plant. If you go for an ecotourism trip, it's a good chance that you won't have a heated shower, which is not the worst thing in the world. They put the water in a tank above, and it heats up a little bit in the sun. And as you can see, it's outdoors, but it's not like ice cold. It's not like taking a cold shower in Minnesota winter. It's just like not super. It's not hot, but you get a little visitor while you're showering. And like I said, these recycling bins are kind of all over. It really has become the cultural norm of, instead of just like throwing garbage out in the ground, finding out which specific type of recycling they should be a part of. Squirrel. Right, real emphasis on organic. That's a new thing that's really in vogue. All-terrain vehicles are a bit controversial. I know they wouldn't seem that they'd be controversial, but in places that are selling themselves as being eco-friendly, if you stay on like designated paths or are driving these maybe on the beach or whatnot, they're perfectly fine. But in lots of landscapes, they really do tear up the land. And if people are just kind of taking them wherever they want through the rainforest, they smash up a lot of seedlings and a lot of, they really ground the places up. So that's why it's kind of like, well, is that a sustainable thing? That was enough info. Well, actually, I did want to also show the actual rainforest. Like I said, a lot of these pictures, I'm just showing the roots and how much they keep the landscape together in the tropics, right? So you can imagine again, if this gets cut down, how this whole land here would then be susceptible to loss. And this is also why they're really trying to prioritize trees that are next to farms, because they're not disconnected. Like these make it so that your farm's soil is less likely to be washed away. This was an area next to a river where, well, the tree hadn't been cut down, but it did die. And then once its roots rotted, right, the landscape started to get lost, and they put up man-made barriers to try to kind of keep the land from washing away. But there's so much rain in the tropics that it's tough to keep that kind of infrastructure up. Another effort to kind of keep the land from subsiding, but as you can see, it's mostly filled with water, so it's mixed amount of success. This is some more of the rainforest in Costa Rica. These are some examples of, I had an image that I showed you last week. Did I have it here? I don't think I have it here. But it was an image about how the indigenous populations would use these trees as a kind of natural dam to keep the land from kind of falling into the water. And so I got some pictures of these trees and how they really do kind of form these barriers to stop land loss as long as they exist. When they're cut down, of course, this whole area can just degrade. But if you can see how wide these root systems are. Alligator. It's the only alligator I saw. I know it's not the best picture. Sloths, pretty easy to catch sloths. Again, just showing how the roots keeping everything, holding it in. Things like power lines, which, you know, every place wants to develop, and development usually means power. But part of the reason lots of places are turning toward having like solar or independent means of power is because if you put in a power line, you have to maintain the area around it, and that usually means you're clear cutting an area. Not only are you clear cutting it, but you're usually keeping it cut so that you can maintain the power. But that allows invasive species also to more easily change through ecosystems. So this is still in Costa Rica. I'm starting to go upriver, and as you more go into the country's interior, you get basically poorer and poorer populations. The reason a lot of these houses are up on stilts like this, if you've ever seen these in other pictures, this is the dry season, right? So the water is at a low point, but of course that means that there is a wet season, and there's a time that the water is at a high point. So there's lots of things locals have done to make it so that their house doesn't get flooded out, including constructing like this. Or having your housing floating on the water. Obviously then whatever level the water is at, your house isn't going to flood out because it's floating on top of it, right? Just going upriver a bit to see kind of how locals are doing. These are some of the kind of classic agricultural worker housing in lots of areas of the world that are developing. All right. I think that's all I'm going to show you of Costa Rica. All right. Well, today, rather than come out and do cards, I think I'm going to let you self-select. And this is a question right out of our textbook. Because I'm not going to come out and give you cards, you can have, you know, slightly bigger groups. So maybe groups. This doesn't write at all. Groups like seven to 9 people per group, you know? Well, none of these work, right? All right, self-assemble, some mega groups, work on these questions. These are pretty simple questions. Oh. I know these are pretty easy. That's why I normally don't use the questions that are out of the book, but I just will this time.